It's a pleasure to be here, but in all fairness, I suppose I should begin by saying that I am not Richard Rodriguez. I am the creation of Richard Rodriguez, the young man who is closer in age to many of you in the room, especially those of you in the back of the room. That young man wrote Hunger of Memory, and he released me. He freed me from the nightmares and the anxieties that he had as a boy growing up in Sacramento, California. And I'm just going to remind you, as you listen to me, trying to channel him, that one of the functions of education is to teach you, especially in a school like this, where you are taught to not be afraid of music, of singing, of writing music, of dancing, of acting, is to give voice to voices within you that otherwise you might not want to express. And everything pushes down on you. All of your friends push down on you. Don't write about that. And your mother writes you a letter and says to you, I don't want you writing about our personal life for los gringos. And you put that letter into your book. That's what Richard Rodriguez did. The organizers of this morning's session asked me to talk about the question, do we need a common public language? Listen to that question. Do we need a common public language? And the answer is yes. So goodbye and good luck. It's been very nice meeting you. I flew all the way out from California and was sitting in Detroit while you were doing more interesting things last night. But I was thinking to myself, do we need a common public language? The only thing interesting about that question are those two words, public and common. Those are really interesting words. There was a time in my life when I would not have gotten, even in my imagination, up to this microphone because I did not know how to sound a public language. I did not know how to sound a public voice. I did not know what it means to have a public voice. I go to fancy schools like this now, and many of the schools make a point of having students take me around the campus, getting students to learn how to talk to a stranger, getting students to introduce a stranger at a podium, getting students to ask questions even when the questions are rehearsed. Those are lessons that come from education. And I would propose this morning that we have forgotten that the primary instruction of education is language. That's what we used to call those first years of schooling grammar school. You hear that? Grammar school. And we used to talk in America about public schools. Turns out that a lot of public schools aren't so public anymore. That a lot of students come out and they don't have a sense of the public. They might have a sense of their tribe or their hood, barely a sense of themselves. And we have told them that they have just been to public school. One of the reasons a lot of rich kids go to private schools is because that's one of the few places where you can get a public education these days. Anyway, I want to tell you first of all about a friend of mine who's a bank robber. He was a very prolific bank robber when he was closer in your age than to me, but I think he robbed 48 banks before they finally caught him. And he spent a number of years up in Connecticut in a jail, which is where he contacted me. We will call him Joe. Joe is a bank robber, and he tells me a very interesting story about language. One day, Joe robbed 3 banks in San Diego. That's a pretty good thing to do. Most of the money he did was to give it to girlfriends who drove away with fancy cars, and he never saw them again. Joe robbed 3 banks in San Diego, and he was driving his own BMW on the San Diego freeway, and it gave out. And there he is with this loot in the trunk, and sitting on a freeway, and he doesn't know exactly what the next step is, but in his rearview mirror, there is the California Highway Patrol. And this guy gets out, big strapping blonde guy, gets out, says, what's the problem to Joe? And Joe says, and here's the mystery. Joe went to a Christian right-wing evangelical school in Orange County, and he learned how to talk. He looks like a thug. His tats begin about here and go all the way down to his thighs. There's a Virgin Mary on one thigh and the devil on the other thigh, and when he does squats, the Virgin Mary goes this way and the devil goes that way. But Joe knows how to talk. He knows how to make the policeman not afraid of him. He can sound a blonde surfer voice, like that. Joe said, would you believe it? This Beamer, out. He said, would you guys give me a lift to the gas station? He sits in the back seat of the police car as they're driving to the gas station, and Joe says, I've been sitting here and seeing all these police cars go whizzing by. What's going on? And the guy driving says, they're looking for a bank robber. They're looking for a voice. They're looking for a thug who sounds some particular way, like in the movies. They're not looking for Joe. The power of language to introduce you or to disqualify you in public conversation. Tell me about it. You watch Judge Judy as well as I do. And when she comes on with the bad teeth and she can't say it, she's already guilty. When Joe was in prison in Connecticut, he was having this anxiety because he was reading W.H. Auden and Dostoevsky, and he had no one to talk to about it. And so he saw me on the NewsHour. In those days, the NewsHour and PBS was sort of in prisons, one of the few shows you were able to watch. It was sort of extra punishment. So along with Julia Child, he had to watch the NewsHour, and he saw me on the NewsHour, and he wanted to talk to me. He wanted to engage me in conversation, and he wrote me a letter of seduction. I will tell you right now that I have no secret sexual fetish about men behind bars. But I was interested in this letter, 12-page letter, about English literature. And for 3 years, we had a correspondence about God, about the nature of violence, about Russian mysticism, and Irish literature. Not bad. I've come here today to stand before you to talk about what it means to be public. But I grew up, as some of you know, a minority student. What some of you mean by that, I think, is that I grew up brown in America. I grew up ethnic in America. These are Indian lips, pre-Columbian Indian lips. This is a pre-Columbian Indian nose. And I know in the cowboy movie the Indians were supposed to have died, but I'm alive. I grew up a minority student. And no one knew exactly what to make of that, except they knew that something was wrong with me. Something was wrong in my life. I hear myself sounding now, and it's not these English words that I hear. It's this public voice that I hear. This voice that I had to learn. The advantage I had growing up was Ireland. The Irish. I know the Irish are... They try to pass themselves off in America as very sentimental people, Danny Boy and all the rest of it. And they all go to bars on St. Patrick's Day and they get drunk and they sing their old songs. These are very tough people. And I was educated for the first 8 years of my schooling by 8 Irish nuns. Not Irish Americans, 8 Irish nuns. And they were not fooling around. They came 6,000 miles to California to shove the English language down my throat. The language of the Irish oppressor down my throat. You get it? And that little one, the one with the mustache, she was relentless. Listen to her. Stand up. Get your hands out of your pockets. This is all said with an Irish brogue. I can't hear you. I can't hear what you're saying. When you speak, look at me. She's not telling me to speak English. She's telling me to speak to a stranger. It took 2.5 years. And then one day, and I don't remember the day of necessity, I raised my hand in class and volunteered an answer. And that day, I would like to propose to you, I was not a minority. There are many minorities that I meet in America, and a lot of them are white, as we prefer to call them. In fact, a number of them are red and pink. A lot of white people are colors not white. This is white. It's very rare to meet a white person except an albino. But in Appalachia, sometimes I go to these Baptist schools in Appalachia, and I meet kids with really bad teeth. And I meet kids who are real minorities, though nobody in government calls them that. And that is that they don't have a voice. They don't know how to do what you know how to do almost instinctively. To speak to a stranger. Some gift. I have the reputation of being culturally, if not politically, conservative, because as Marina was saying, on some public issues of my generation, affirmative action, bilingual education, I'll just say about affirmative action, that it would come to me at the end of my schooling, at a point in which I was least a minority, in the sense that I'm using that term, most aware of myself as a member of public society. When it came to me at the end of my education rather than when it should come to students of the lower class at the beginning of their education, that it was ethnic or race-based rather than class-based, that it should go to children of poverty, regardless of color. And the other was bilingual education. I remember in those years having to listen to grammar school and high school teachers talking about the necessity of having children speak their family language in the classroom. And I thought, and many years had confirmed by Hannah Arendt, who distinguishes private life from public life, that there is no way to use a family language in the classroom. That the point of family language is it is spoken by family. And the moment you move it into the classroom, it becomes a theatrics. Such a simple lesson. The transaction of a classroom, they will say, these teachers will say, is to teach children self-esteem. And I think to myself, that's not the function of a classroom. The function of a classroom is to humiliate a student. Is to teach a student what he doesn't know. How much of the world there is. I remember when I was in graduate school thinking, I'll never know anything. There's so much to know. The best lesson I ever got was at Columbia by a teacher at Columbia who said, start with 1 year. Choose any year. 1782. And learn everything you can about that year. And suddenly, the years around it will start to flower. And suddenly you will begin to live in a century. And suddenly the century will edge up against another century. And suddenly you're talking about the 18th and 19th century. And they say, you know, what we need in the classroom right now is Ebonics. We need to teach kids we need to encourage children to use the language of the street in the classroom. Because what we do now is we tell students that they can't use the language of the street in the classroom. And so you have this notion that common usage has no point in education. That you can say whatever you want because it's what you are saying. If you teach composition, as I have over the years, including in some prisons, what you often will find are these papers that have no coherence. The spellings are completely eccentric, the logic is non-existent, and whatever it is the paper intends to say is not clear to the reader. And I will say, I don't understand a word of this. And the writer will say, well, I understand it. And the writer will assume that the exercise is about self-expression. I'm expressing myself, man. Don't dampen this. I'm letting it out, man. And I say, this is not about you expressing yourself. Sorry. You came to the wrong channel. This is about me making sense of what you're saying. This is about you learning to make sense in my language. Now there's this discussion in America about the words we cannot use. Well, the only word we can't use is the N-word. The N-word. None of us will say it. Not at this microphone we won't say it. But on the street we say it. Or they say it. Or 50 Cent says it. I go to this yuppie gym in the Castro district in San Francisco. There are 2 blocks of projects that I walk by on Fillmore Street. There was a shooting that I watched about 2 months ago. But for 2 blocks, we turn into a street, the real street. And these brothers use the N-word a lot. And the thump of the music that goes by in the car, the convertible, is real N-word stuff. But I live in a neighborhood about half a mile down the road of this Victorian houses occupied by billionaires in Silicon Valley who don't use the N-word. Recently, the New York Times used the F-word. And there was a flutter. All of us who listened to NPR, that we were all fluttering like little pigeons. But no one on NPR uses the N-word. And that's partly the function of what we call common usage. There are certain things we do not allow ourselves to say in public. And those kids on Fillmore Street do it, partly to remind me as I walk past that I'm not in their tribe. It's their freedom. It's their rebellion. It's their independence from me, from us, from propriety, from middle class common usage. Do we need a common public language was the question. Understand that what I'm saying to you now is not English, but public language. I'm not speaking to you in the voice that I speak to my friends. I'm not speaking to you in the words that I make love. I'm speaking to you as strangers. And sometimes I might know somebody in an audience, and I will say, please don't come because I want to talk to that last group of students over there from Queens and the Bronx. I don't want to know anybody out there. Because there are things you can say to strangers that you can't say to people you know. Because the person you know over there will be smiling. The person you know over there thinks that they know all about you. It's like when the phone rings at home, when it used to ring at home, and you would answer the phone with your adult voice, your public voice, and your kid brother would start laughing in the background because he knows your real voice, the voice you use at home, your private voice. Your private voice. This woman I know, she's quite elderly now. She went to Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, a very fancy women's school, and I guess it's fancy. She's pretty fancy. She's very grand. She went to Bryn Mawr in the 50s when there were, I would guess, not very many African American students. You see what I just said? African American students? Common usage. And she, I was telling you black, but I said African American students. And she said, she remembers from me as having read Hunger of Memory. She remembers walking home, coming home to South Carolina one summer at the end of the semester. And she was walking down the street from the Trailways bus station with her suitcase. And the heat of the sidewalk was already coming through her shoes. She could feel the heat through her shoes and the quiet of the southern town. She gets to her house, and her mother is standing behind the screen door. And she climbs the 5 steps of the house, and the screen door yawns open. And her mother says, "I don't want you speaking white in here." one of the things you learn as a scholarship boy or a scholarship girl is to be bilingual. And I don't mean French and German. I mean learning to speak in two very different ways. And the teacher at school says, you know, we don't use double negatives. And then going home and hearing at least that when your father is speaking. There are kids who get beat up using the wrong voice with their friends at the street corner. And there is an intricate, what shall we call it, a political negotiation that you have to figure out about which voice am I going to use with my relatives today. Often it's a question of diction. Do I use that word or not that, or that word? Do I mispronounce a word because that's the way it's done? Do I use their accent or her accent, my teacher's accent? Which voice do I use? I'm using your voice right now so that you can understand me. But do not misunderstand. I have other voices within me. If you were really smart, you wouldn't have invited me here at all. You would have invited H.L. Mencken, but H.L. Mencken is dead. He was a great journalist in Baltimore. Wonderful pieces for the Baltimore Sun. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I don't think anybody in this room reads H.L. Mencken anymore, and your life is poor for it. You're reading Lady Gaga's blog instead. And you're dying. Your soul is dying. It's withering right now. That's why you're bored. Because you're not reading Mencken writes this great book called The American Language. And for Mencken, what he would say about Richard Rodriguez at this moment is that he's not speaking English, he's speaking American. That as early as the 1840s, listen to that, cowboy time, the 1840s, the British were saying, those Americans don't speak English. Already that by the 1840s, there were American Indian words in our vocabulary. Moccasin. There was a cadence to the American speech that was African. And everyone used it. Our words were slanted in a direction that was not toward England. It had its own energy. We don't speak like Lady Diana. We speak like Annie Oakley. And then the immigrants came to New York and Philadelphia and Boston along the East Coast. And suddenly there were German words, German expressions. Usually it's food. Food is the first thing because we put in language as food. I'll have some of that spaghetti. Words for I kind of like you. When he starts flirting with her. Words for violence. All of us speak Arabic now after September 11th. We know the word jihad. And then this vast, vast Mexican border is bringing in, as we speak, Spanish into... It's the genius of the language to keep swallowing, keep taking it in, keep using it. So Madeleine Albright, you won't remember Madeleine Albright, she was a little woman, she was the Secretary of State a few years ago under Bill Clinton. And she got up one day on the news and was referring to some country or some politician in some faraway country as not having cojones. And I said, am I dreaming or has my father won the battle? This business of Spanish now, it is on my hotel channel in 3 versions. And you can hear all these white people from Latin America, and my mother used to watch these telenovelas with all these Latin American stars who look Swedish. It's like watching Swedish TV. And now Univision has organized, because of their power, they've trotted out the politicians, few of whom, except for George Bush, who spoke better Spanish than he does English. They trot them out to have a bilingual event, usually in Miami, and all the rich orange-haired women will come. And their rich Latino husbands from New Jersey, who have the beer concession in Bayonne, they will come, and although they all speak English, it will be conducted in this kind of dumb show as though we need to hear it in Spanish. My father. My father, who had 2 years of grammar school education in Mexico. My father, who remains in memory probably the smartest man I know, who had no brakes, nothing, who ended up making false teeth for a living, surrounded by trays and trays of false teeth. My father had a skepticism in him about life, how hard life is. And he couldn't make any sense out of my luck. He called me lucky boy. You're a lucky boy. But my father was, in his skepticism, when he was first presented in California some years ago with a trilingual voting ballot, Chinese, Spanish, English, Ingles. My father said probably the best thing about a trilingual voting ballot that I've ever heard. He said the trouble with the trilingual or bilingual voting ballot is that you end up voting for the translator. It's pretty good. Because you end up voting for what someone has told you in Spanish, that George Romney, or whatever his name is, what was Romney's first name? Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was a Stanford student when I was there, and he was so pretty. Like Mormons are always pretty, and it's an argument against drinking coffee. But I think to myself, the Church of Latter-day Saints is not the fastest growing church in Spanish. The international church is going to become Spanish speaking. I'd like to talk to you about religion, the subject of my new book, Darling, but I know religion is sort of verboten on liberal arts campuses. We don't do that anymore. Well, I hate to tell you, but the world is doing that out there, and they're doing that in very, very strong ways. And if you graduate from the school without having read the Quran, you should sue Leon Botstein. You want your money back. Try it on him. See what he says. You end up voting for the translator. There's another problem. Not only are we becoming a semi-bilingual society, but we have become children of a digital age. And I'm sorry, I know I'm an old-timer, and I'm not, but I have my little fingers, and I can do the same thing your little fingers can do. And I go to classes now from Madrid to Columbus, Ohio, to Seoul, Korea, and usually in the back rows. That's where you'll see the little apple opened up. The little Steve Jobs Memorial Chapel back there. And I say to the teachers, well, do you let them do that in the class? And they say, well, you can't stop them from doing that. Or they'll look at their cell phone, Sometimes I think that America invented Henry Ford because we were getting tired of the house. We wanted to be on the road. We wanted to get out. We wanted to leave New Jersey for Ohio. So we invented Henry Ford, and he created the Model T. I think we created Steve Jobs. I think we've grown so desperate for contact that we invented Steve Jobs, and he gave us this little, what shall I say, this little present. Always in touch. Always in touch. You with them, and the NSA with you. You're never alone. You don't have to be alone. Your boyfriend is texting you right now. That jerk. If you marry him, don't tell me in a few years, why didn't you say something? I'm telling you now, don't marry him. And she says to me, well, I have 2,000 friends. I live in Mark Zuckerberg's universe. I like. I dislike. And I think Ellen DeGeneres has 2 million friends. Like. So she's better than you are. And now this has become a kind of neurosis. I'm hoping that your children will get so disgusted with their parents always looking at these machines that they will maybe read a book or go off for a hike with Henry Thoreau. There are stories that you hear now of people who are mowed down by buses and trucks Because they were getting emails from their boyfriend or something. I don't know what she was doing. And you sit on the subway, but you can't sit on the subway, so instead you look at reruns of The Simpsons. But you've seen that before. You've been there. And the subway's more interesting to you. Look at that guy leering at you. You want to look at Homer Simpson instead? This neurosis about public life, that I don't want to be public in public. I'm here. I'm not there. I'm plugged in now. I can't hear you. These guys at the gym, I go to this gay gym, and we're all like this, and they're all like this. And you would think that these guys, because they're queer and beautiful and muscled, they would be looking at each other. But you know what they do between sets? They look at their machine. This other guy here is not interesting to them. I got to look at this. We are losing the body. You're losing it right now. At a time in your life when you should be most aware of your body, you are texting, and it's in this little language of mice. The language of the internet is this little mice language. It's what mice would talk like. LOL. Because the little mice feet don't have that many toes, and so they had to write in these little abbreviated vocabularies. And everything is a letter instead of a word, because it's fast. And I got to talk to him fast. Brad wants me to talk to him real fast. Can't wait. Well, good luck with you and Brad. The point of writing is not simply self-expression, but is learning how to speak to the stranger. That is what public language is about. That is what common language is about. Not merely the language that your friends speak, but the language of the adult, of the old fogey, of the person who doesn't tweet. I still don't know what LOL meant. Sometimes I think it's lots of love, and sometimes I think laughing out loud, and sometimes I think you just misspelled it. I'm going to say the most paradoxical thing now, and if you write this down and repeat it in the paper, you'll probably get an A. But the basis of public language is not the we, but the I. The person who can form an I is the person who is already seeking out a listener, another. Richard Rodriguez, when he was writing Hunger of Memory, was looking for you, the stranger, the person he never expected to meet, the person that he still is embarrassed to meet. The only people who know that in our society don't have PhDs in English literature at this college, but they tend to be, they used to be. I don't know whether 10-year-old girls keep diaries anymore. But they did when I was growing up. My sister had one. Dear Diary. Used to be at an age where the body is beginning to sexually tell her things that she doesn't know how to say to anybody. Dr. Phil is not around. Dear Diary, today you'll never believe what happened. And Diary listens to everything. And then she would lock it. It was a little blue diary. You know what my mother did when she found it under her pillow? She ripped it open. There is no private language here. There is only the language of family. I'm going to tell you a true story. It's the last story I will tell you about the I, about the daring to be an I, daring to be lonely, daring not to be a member of the team. Schools like this have a real double message they give you. On the one hand, they grade you as an I, and if they find out that you're plagiarizing her paper, they will give you an F, or at least some kind of punishment. But everything is organized like a we. Let's go out and exercise together. Let's join the glee club, sing together. And they've even made a we out of wrestling. Wrestling is the most individualistic sport there is. One guy, one guy. But now there are wrestling teams at these colleges. They turned everything into a team. So that it's very hard to figure out, well, when today am I going to have time to be an I. Because I was going to go to the library this afternoon to be an I, but Brad wants to come too, and then he takes off his shoes and starts tickling me on my legs. You think I'm kidding? I know Brad. My last story is about teaching English composition at about this time of the day in California. It was quite early. It's 8 o'clock in California. This was at Berkeley. The first and last course I ever taught. It was in the English department. It was freshman English. And because it was that hour, 8 o'clock in the morning, I didn't get too many students, but I did get a large group of the freshman football team. And they would come in, usually it would be 8:02, 8:03, and there was nothing. And then you would hear this sort of the buffalo coming down the hallway. They would all come in a group. At my university, Stanford now, the coach has somehow convinced the football team all to wear their jacket everywhere and all to eat only together. And I think this is madness. This is as alien to a university culture as it is possible to be. And I go to high schools all around this country where young people have segregated themselves according to every possible fetish. Over there are the jocks, over there are the nerds, over there are the Christians, over there are I don't know who they are, the girls with the green and blue hair, I don't know who they are. And then someone says they're the sluts. And so I sit, well, I'll sit with them. Anyway, the football team comes in, and there are these two guys in the back. I see them. They're there. They're always, at any speech I give, they're always together. Steve and Lance. Lance is like about 200 pounds. Bambi on steroids. Steve is his friend. They're not queer, but they're close. And they're always together. And there's Steve calling right now. Got to get a message from Brad. And the curious thing is that who is that? Is that a bird in a tree? Is that the end of Midsummer Night's Dream? Steve and Steve is this really cool guy, really cool, and there's nothing you can say, there isn't anything you can say that Steve has not already thought about. So Steve will give you a kind of half smile every morning. I don't care about Steve. I'm not interested in Steve. I don't get anything from Lance. It's like talking to Bambi. I don't know what to say that will get Bambi to speak. Speak to me. It drives teachers crazy because it's the point of our lives, to get a student to sound a public question, to say something in front of your friends that has nothing to do with them but is addressed to me. That revolutionary moment. Do it. One day I was talking about writing about experiences that are beyond language, like terror. You're going to get beaten this weekend by USC. You're going to get mowed down by their football team. The interesting thing about terror is that people speak of it as being beyond words. So that often when you are terrorized, what do? You don't say, I'm terrorized. You say, ah! How do you write that? How do you write experiences that are beyond language? That's a pretty interesting question. Well, of course, there was this vast silence. And I thought, well, I'm not paid by the hour, I'm just paid by the semester, so I'm going to wait them out. I'm going to wait the football team out. Wait for something. Wait for someone. And Lance raised his hand. Ladies and gentlemen, Lance has raised his hand. Yes. This was my Sidney Poitier moment. This was the moment I've been waiting for all my life. He began talking about the Witch and the Wizard of Oz, and how as a boy he was so frightened of the Witch and the Wizard of Oz. And I don't know what he was saying. It was idiotic, but it was wonderful. I thought to myself, he's trusting me with this information. And Steve was watching me. And Steve was thinking, I know he was thinking, because he tweets me all the time. Steve was thinking, you think you've won. You think you've got him. Watch out for your closest friends. They're the ones that are not going to let you go. They're not going to let you go. The girl sitting right next to you whose elbow you're touching, she's not going to let you go. In the middle of this monologue about the Witch and the Wizard of Oz, Lance looked over nervously to Steve and saw this look that said, what are you doing? Why are you saying this? You're embarrassing me. And that moment, bang! He stopped. I never got him back again. Never heard from him again. He's probably on some freeway outside of Phoenix, driving hunched over now in his late 40s. And his wife, his second wife, is saying, why don't you ever, you go into these long silences. Where do you go? Blame Steve. There are things your closest friends, your family, will not let you say. And you better learn a way to say them, or sing them, or dance them. Otherwise, they will kill you. They will turn into cancer and kill you. And if you're relying on that guy who's sitting next to you right now, who's whispering in your ear, you're going to end up where he ends up. Anyway, I travel a lot, and I often go to hotels and dreary places. Boston is not a dreary place, but it was a hotel over by Soldiers Field, and it was a dreary Saturday or Sunday, I forget which. I often turn the TV set when I get it on when I get into a room just to warm it up. And there was an NFL game on, and I sort of was interested and not interested. The Washington Redskins. I thought, well, as Indians, they must be pretty good. And suddenly I saw on the sidelines, Steve. There was Steve. His eyes blackened. And the coach was reprimanding him for something. And you could see Steve was taking it all in. He was all serious. Just, yeah, coach, yeah, whatever you say, coach. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And all the respect he would refuse to give to me, he gave to this high-priced coach. I have come here all the way from California to say to you that the Washington Redskins, that they lost. There is a God. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What should I call you now? I don't even know. I did have his wallet so close to me during the whole talk. I almost stole it, but I didn't. Thank you.
Take my credit cards and take me to Paris.
Okay, I'll do that. So we should take advantage of this wonderful, how could I describe you? You're nothing like in the book. I was so cross with you when I read your book, and now you've disarmed me. I hate you.
He has made that possible. Do you understand that?
I do.
That's the function of art, is to.
You speak. He. You call yourself he. Richard Rodriguez. Well, thank you. And I want to also thank you for telling these wonderful students who are right now tweeting Brad. He is so right. Don't ever take your computers in the classroom. Don't ever take your cell phones in the classroom. It's the only place where you actually are free from all this junk. Please, please. I don't let my students, when I see them under the table, when they're not allowed to go to the bathroom. I know they're not going to the bathroom. They're going to tweet Brad. Brad is everywhere. So let me just ask a very difficult question before I open this up to all of you, and I warn you, please be to the point. We have so many people who would like to talk to RR, Can I call you
Yes,
RR?
RR.
That's better. But so when I was listening to you, I had this. I remember how last week in Penn Station, I went to get a sandwich, and the kid selling me the sandwich didn't look at me, was picking his nose, basically threw the sandwich at me without even knowing what gender I was, whether I may be handicapped in a wheelchair, nothing. And I thought to myself, I so wish that the person who had trained them had said, listen, talk to the people as though they're human. Start a small conversation. But when you say all this, everything seems so easy when you say it. It makes us all feel, yes, okay, our life is going to change now. Everything's going to be wonderful the way you inspire us. But that's not how it works. That's not what's going to happen next time we get a sandwich in Penn
Well,
Station.
but you must use your disadvantages wisely. You know, I was queer. I didn't speak that about myself or didn't admit that to anyone. I did not go to the junior prom. And there were two alternatives. Either I could be solitary and bereft, or I could be solitary and free. And there's a scene at the end of this movie that was made about Hannah Arendt, a German film that I saw this summer. And it ends with her thinking. And she's by herself, thinking. It's a very difficult thing to film, because people in Hollywood will say, well, thinking isn't doing anything. You're just sitting there. So we in the audience don't know that you're thinking. We know she is thinking. Well, if you're very, if you're out of sorts with the people in your school, you can use that to your advantage. I was out of sorts with being Mexican American, and so I grew up absorbed by the Black Civil Rights Movement. It became for me a way of, replacing Mexico, to follow that procession through the South in the 1950s and 60s. We shall overcome. Well, on prom night in Sacramento, Malcolm X was in town. And I don't know whether you know who Malcolm X is. I was in Omaha not long ago at a black and brown high school, and I mentioned his name, and you would be astonished by how many young people do not know who he was. In Omaha, where his father's house was burned down, where there is still a sign on the vacant lot that he once lived there, where his anger began to well. I didn't know at that time, when I took the bus, I don't know what I told my parents I was going to do. Maybe go to a movie. At least I saved some girl from the long evening of having to wear my corsage and having small talk with this strange Mexican kid. So I took the bus and went across town to the south side, to this community hall I'd never been in before. Use your solitude. And there were these two guys at the door. One of them looked like Sonny Liston. The other one looked like Mike Tyson. They were big guys in black suits, white starched shirts. And I looked in, and I could tell that there were only black people in there. Not African Americans, black people. And I went up the steps, and they looked at me with this quizzical look that said, what are we going to do about the Mexican kid? And they let me in. And I sat there, listening to Malcolm. And I was the only non-black in the room, though a lot of us were brown, in fact. We were as brown as Barack Obama, but we called ourselves black. And none of them seemed surprised or puzzled. It was my freedom to be there. And they granted it to me. You will often find, I know celebrities in Hollywood, and I'm not talking about Madonna, but celebrities in Hollywood who always say that, the thing about being famous is not that people come up with pieces of paper for you to sign in restaurants when you don't want to sign it, is that everybody thinks you're unapproachable. And that if you are precocious and you get over that inhibition that keeps us all with our own kind, you can get things. I go to those high schools when everybody segregated themselves, and then there'll be one kid, one day, it's famous, One kid one day who came over from that table to sit at that table, and it caused a revolution. He ended up at Yale. He's probably now back to being Brad, and that bravery of the moment may have not served him well. But you can get things that way. That's where you learn. Why are you reading that book? Why are you going to that lecture? Why are you learning that language? Your friends will ask you, and I'm telling you, the answer is the I. Because I want to. Because I'm interested in it. Because I saw Malcolm once on TV, and he wasn't like Martin Luther King Jr., he wasn't like any of them. He was angry. And that thin, sort of corpse-like face he had. And I wanted to be in the presence of that man. I wanted to hear his anger. I'm going to be teaching at Columbia for 3 weeks for a couple of weeks. And one of the things I'm going to do when I'm there is go up to the ballroom where he was assassinated to pay my respects. That's what you do with your freedom. You become more than them. You become more than your friends. And they come with you or they don't. And if they don't, too bad.
Thank you. Michelle, do you have a question?
Short question. It seems from what you're saying and modeling that there are many public languages that you use.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could tell us today how you thought about and decided to use the public language that you've used with us.
I'm assuming that people in this room speak conventional standard English. I'm assuming that this is a college and high school audience, that I can use words fairly easily, that I can make certain references to popular culture, The Simpsons, for example. But I've been in cultures where you can't assume that ahead of time. I remember when I was giving a lecture to an association of shopping center owners at Cape Town, at the convention center. I went through this whole thing in my hotel room. Well, if I say this, will they understand that word and so forth? When you start moving beyond, your little universe, you become aware of how many cultural references we have that already will be lost in 10 years. You go to schools where 9/11 already now is becoming the kids. Well, I was in grammar school, or I wasn't old enough then. And so you have to reorganize your language. Always know that you have to do that because language is fluid. What Mencken would said about the English language is that it keeps adding to itself. It isn't static. It isn't French. There's no Académie Française that will ponder whether we should have le weekend as part of the vocabulary. We don't do that. We just go on MTV and some girl is chewing gum and adds the words of the language. That's the greatness of America, but the vulgarity of America is that some girl chewing gum on MTV has just added the words of the language. And we've lost other words in the process. I think we've lost the word gay. Charlie Rose once asked me on whether I liked being a gay writer, and I said, I'm not a gay writer, I'm a morose writer. Gay was this little lovely adjective that we used to describe a spring day. And then it became ponderous, and I'm very happy with who I am. And if you don't believe it, I call myself gay. And I think to myself, but I'm not gay. And now I'm supposed to be, I know they're going to ask me, because I have this new book on religion after September 11th, they're going to ask me whether my partner and I, listen to the word I just used, so we're lawyers together, my partner and I of 30 years are going to get married. And I think to myself, I don't want to get married. And you meet these gay couples, and he introduces him as his husband, and he's his husband, and it's all this kind of confusion. The bravery of the feminist movement in the 1960s when I was growing up was that they found a word, Ms., that was so radical that everyone could be Ms., whether you were a mother, whether you didn't want to be a mother in public, whether you were divorced, whether you were single, never been married, you were Ms. And you were announcing that you didn't have to be judged by your relationships in the private sphere.
I'm going to interrupt you because I don't want these wonderful kids to not ask you a question.
Yes, ask me.
I am going to privilege the youngsters, so
Yes.
I'm not trying to offend the oldsters.
And if-
You see,
Yes.
I'm not politically correct here. The oldsters will have to wait. So, questions, please.
Yes, from young people under the age of 21.
Yes. No question?
Tweet me something.
No, don't let the oldsters win. Over there, the person to the left. Yes,
Yes.
you. I'm learning.
So a lot of your remarks, or at least you definitely touched on this, was about how social media sort of corrupts young people and about the bad influence of technology. But I would say that a lot of it sort of borders on technophobia. And I would ask, do you think that sort of all of this techno-bashing is just alienating yourselves further from our generation?
Possibly, and maybe you should want that. But maybe you're alienating yourself also from civilizations. I've been in the Middle East, and my experience of young people there, particularly the spooky ones, is that they have relationships to sacred words, which are textual. That when kids in these Sharia schools read and memorize the Quran, they hold it like a lover in their arms, and they absorb it. And the very weight of the text, like the Torah at a bar mitzvah. The day I go to a bar mitzvah in West Los Angeles, and the kid comes in with a Kindle, I am leaving that temple. But because the weight of the Torah is its meaning. This is the manifestation of God's speech in our lives, in our space and time. And its weight, which is why it's carried on shoulders and it is kissed and held aloft, its weight is as palpable as a child. Well, no. There are these two GIs at an Air Force base somewhere in Afghanistan who tweet all day to their girlfriends in Phoenix. And they go to the prison library and they see the the Quran, and there are all these notations in the margins. And they, of course, don't read Arabic. And they think these prisoners are exchanging messages to each other in the marginalia. And what do Americans do? We who think that the book has no weight, we throw it in the fire. And when that news comes out in the world, the world is aflame. And for technophobia, I would say there's a technophilia that is also blind to what the rest of the world is doing. And part of the function of this school is to teach you that there are other ways of communicating. There are other ways of regarding a book than merely a screen. And you better figure out why so many of the people who are inventing these gadgets are middle-aged like me. And they all live in my neighborhood, and they all pay $5 million for little Victorian houses, and they all live like little gingerbread people. And then they drive away in cars that go 500 miles an hour, but they're on city streets, so they can't go very fast, and they're stuck in traffic. Tweeting.
Let me just say that if you can ask questions by raising your hand, and we encourage them.
Yes.
But you can also email questions to arendt@bard.edu.
No!
Here.
Fire this man.
There is a question from a living person.
Michael Schenk from Simon's Rock.
Nice to meet you.
I think that an important part about your discussion of public language that was left out of your speech is the relationship between public language and power, and how public language serves not only to construct power, but to reinforce power. And I have to say that I disagree with what you said about communication not being about the expression of the self, but rather making yourself intelligible to another.
It's the meeting of those two moments. That is, you telling me as you're doing now, and me comprehending.
I guess the person that my mind keeps going back to is Rachel John Tell. Anybody remember her? Trayvon Martin's friend in the trial?
Yes, I was thinking of her just this morning.
Yes, and it was generally acknowledged by the media and everyone that her testimony was a big loss for the prosecution.
Yes. Tell them why.
because she failed to speak the public language. She failed to speak the language of the courts. She failed to speak the language of the jury.
And it turned out that she couldn't write cursive either, remember? That the document that she had supposedly written was written for her. And then we began to suspect that this might not be what we are thinking. But go ahead.
And that's the thing. She reinforced all the ideas that the defense attorneys, the white people in the jury had about who black people are. And I think that's because of that burden that she had on her to speak the language of the court, the language of the public.
Yes.
Because the responsibility was not on the jury to listen to her. I think that to challenge power relations, which the liberal arts education teaches us is an important project, it's important for the other to reach out and try to understand the language
Yes,
of the
that's
community.
that's the humane impulse in you. But I'm telling you, what your analysis of the public's response is also true. And I think what Joe, the bank robber, would tell you is that with his acquisition of that public voice, he had power. And no one knew what to do with this thuggish-looking brown man who spoke like W.H. Auden. And that was when he began to come to me and say, I want a conversation because there's nobody at this prison I can talk to. And it's that limitation of the educated person that is also their freedom. You know, that I can talk to a lot of people in the world, but there are a lot of people I have to teach myself to talk to because I don't know how to do that. In Dickens, in the reform novels that Dickens writes in the 19th century, when one of these, like a miner, who will speak on the page. He'll speak usually in a page that is cluttered with almost a fog of misspellings and mispronunciations. And you realize as a reader, it's like listening to that woman in the trial, that he's doomed. He usually has a daughter who can speak clear, what we call accentless English, and she will be the one that will survive. And it happens at a level that is so deep that we almost don't know that we're hearing it this way. But I'm telling you, language gives off this potency. If I came up here to, you know, one of the things America is doing right now on its public media is we're hiring everybody from England we can get as England begins to fade away. They're all coming over here and telling us that God is dead as London becomes more Hindu and more Muslim, that Christopher Hitchens comes with his very fancy accent, tell us God is dead, and that we should fight the war in Iraq. And we all we take it seriously because he talks like Cary Grant. And that influence the English have over us with their voices, which is why we hire them to be judges on reality TV, whether it's restaurants, singing contests, everything. They're telling us whether we're good or bad. And Americans love it. We don't hire the French. The French are much... You would think that the woman running Vogue magazine would be French because the French are so stylish. They have this English woman with bangs. She's been there. Anna Wintour has been there for years. And then the English have the worst cooking in the world. They overcook their broccoli. And yet you have these terrible English people who come into these little restaurants in New Jersey and browbeat this woman who's making pasta for the Sopranos and telling her all the reasons that her pasta is awful. Just go to his restaurant in London. His spaghetti is even worse. But that power of the voice, realize that you are victim to it as much as we were when we were listening in the reverse way to that woman testifying. This is a subtle language.
Questions? At the door, yes. Run.
Let's try and keep this brief so that we can have another one after that.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, you wrote in your book, Hunger of Memory, about the scholarship boy. And something that I think I see happening more and more in the world is the idea of the scholarship adult. And the way that once you enter this realm of public language, it becomes all-encompassing and you can't escape back to the realm of private language. Yeah. And so we have situations where politicians or other people, there seems to be a gap between that. They can't speak to us because they can only speak in a certain way. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the limiting nature of public language and how one might get stuck there, if you think this could be so.
Oh, that's really good. You know, I was going to mention the name of an actor I know, an English actor actually, who's been on a show about spaceships. You'll know what it is. Used to have a guy with pointy ears or something. I don't know what they do.
Star Trek.
Star Trek. Maybe it's the other one. Patrick Stewart.
Next generation.
Anyway, Patrick wouldn't be ashamed of my saying this. He's very shy. And one of the things, I know there are actors in this room, young actors who do things on stage that they don't do elsewhere. And one of the things that Patrick can do on stage is that he can proclaim, he can weep, he can insinuate. But often, he'll be the first. He told that to my nephew. I took backstage in New York. He was 12 years old. My nephew, who wanted to be an actor, was very shy. And Patrick said, all of us actors are very shy. We only know this way, and we don't know that way. Well, it is true about our politicians. They don't know how to talk to us, and we don't know how to listen to them. And, Geraldo Rivera, years and years and years and years and years ago, was on WABC in New York, and he went to some kind of hospital or clinic for children, and he began to weep at something he saw. It was completely unscripted. And it was sensational, because no one ever had seen a guy, all those guys with the straight chins and the peroxided hair and all that nobody ever saw anybody weep. And sometimes, somebody will get up in a room and will speak. And it's astonishing, because no one has ever heard anybody speak. We've all heard, professors speak, or politicians speak, or ministers speak. And I think that's, the revolutionaries in the world have found ways of speaking largely to large groups of audiences. I think of Mandela, for example. I think of Martin Luther King Jr., that's the speech at which we remember this year at the Lincoln Memorial 50 years ago. That speech, which was the last time religion sounded so clearly in our public rhetoric, something we can't do anymore because we're not religious people, and now we can't do that anymore, and sorry, we can't talk about heaven, we can't talk about any of that now. But that day, Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, is saying to him, Malcolm, tell him about the dream, tell him about the dream. And he gave that speech. 50 years later, we have a technocrat, a well-educated Harvard Law School, educated, so he must be bright, right? Educated president who gives a speech about the speech. And if any of you can remember one line about the speech, from the speech about the speech, please tell it to me afterwards, because there was no line there. We had lost our soul in that time. That's what what you are saying is so true. Make it a guide for your own life. Find a way to speak, not condescendingly by lowering your speech, but broadly by broadening the audiences that you can find.
Yes, one more question.
Sorry.
Over there. Yes, you with the hair. Yes.
Hi. Hannah Arendt talks about the role of schools in the American nation-state system, as well as just kind of the broader position of educational institutions in political and social movements. And you talked earlier about kind of the state of public education in America at the moment, and privatization and homogenization. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Say that again.
If you could elaborate on what you were talking about, the current state of public education in America.
Oh, that you have to go to a private school to get a public education.
Yeah, elaborate a little more on what you were talking about.
Well, I think, part of our problem is that we've introduced into the pedagogy this notion of self-esteem. We had this notion that we have to appeal to a student by flattering a student or by telling him more about himself than he knows. When I really think that the function of education is to tell a student about other people, about other civilizations. The last thing I wanted to do was learn Spanish in the school. What I should have learned is a difficult language. Paul Theroux said to his brother Peter, who's a friend of mine, Paul Theroux, the travel writer, when Peter was going to Harvard, he said, do you have any instruction? He said, learn a difficult language. And Peter learned Arabic and now works for the State Department, because there are very few people there who speak Arabic. But it seems to me that it's your task. You are presented every semester with an opportunity at this school to learn anything. And there are people that will teach you a wide variety of things. And if you don't want to be homogenized, your task is to make yourself a citizen of the world while you are in this special place that doesn't look like much of the world. But you can make the world part of your conversation if you are brave and if you withstand the questions of your roommate to say, why are you learning Turkish this year? I thought you wanted to learn French and speak to Marina.
Go away. Well, this is unfortunately the end, but the beginning of many new conversations, and let's just all clap for RR. Thank you so much. This is great.